I should have known something was wrong when Sarah found that cruise deal online, $200 for a week-long anniversary trip. The ship looked ancient in the photos, but we figured vintage had its charm. We were young, broke, and celebrating our first year together. What could go wrong? The SS Meridian looked even older in person, like something that should have been scrapped decades ago. The paint was peeling, and there was this weird smell everywhere, like old flowers mixed with seawater. Sarah was excited though, taking selfies by the railings and talking about how romantic it would be. I forced a smile and tried to ignore the creeping feeling in my gut. Our cabin was tiny, and the wallpaper was this faded floral pattern that seemed to move when you weren't looking directly at it. Sarah said I was being paranoid, but I swear those roses shifted positions between when we left for dinner and came back. The bed creaked with every breath, and the porthole looked out into nothing but black water that seemed to go on forever. The first night was when we heard about her. Margaret Whitmore, the other passengers whispered over their cocktails in the lounge. Back in 1905, she'd been travelling with her husband on their honeymoon. Something had happened to her mind during the voyage, some kind of sudden madness that made her scream about things that weren't there. She'd thrown herself overboard on the third night, and they never found her body. I laughed it off as tourist nonsense, but Sarah got quiet after that. She kept staring out our porthole at the dark water, her reflection ghostly in the glass. When I asked what she was thinking about, she just shrugged and said, "The ocean looks different at night, deeper somehow, like it was calling to something." The second day, Sarah started acting strange. She'd stop mid-conversation and tilt her head like she was listening to something I couldn't hear. During lunch, she kept looking over her shoulder at empty corners of the dining room. When I asked if she was okay, she'd snap back to normal and apologise, saying she was just tired from the sea air. That night, I woke up to find her standing at the porthole again. Her nightgown was pressed against the glass and she was whispering something too quiet for me to make out. The moonlight made her look pale and translucent, like she was fading away. I called her name 3 times before she turned around, and for a second, I didn't recognise her eyes. By the third day, it was getting worse. Sarah would disappear for hours, and when I found her, she'd be standing by the railings on the upper deck. She said the water was singing to her, that there was a woman down there who understood what it felt like to be trapped. The crew started giving us weird looks, like they'd seen this before. I tried to keep her in our cabin that night, but she kept pacing back and forth like a caged animal. She said the walls were closing in, that she could hear someone crying in the pipes. The sound was driving her crazy, she said. She needed to find the source and help whoever was making that awful sound. Around midnight she bolted. I chased her through the narrow corridors, past sleeping passengers and flickering lights that seemed to dim as we passed. She was faster than I'd ever seen her, taking stairs 2 at a time toward the upper decks. My heart was pounding so hard I could barely breathe. I found her at the same spot where Margaret Whitmore had jumped over a century ago. Sarah was gripping the railing, her knuckles white in the moonlight. She was talking to someone, having a full conversation, but there was nobody there. Just the black water stretching out in every direction, and the sound of waves lapping against the hull. She turned when she heard me approach, and I saw tears streaming down her face. She said Margaret had been waiting all this time for someone who would understand. Someone who knew what it felt like to love so deeply that losing it would drive you insane. The loneliness had been eating at Margaret for over 100 years, and now she'd found a friend. I begged Sarah to come back to the cabin with me. I promised we'd get off at the next port, fly home, never talk about this cruise again. But she just shook her head and said it was too late. Margaret needed her now, and she couldn't abandon someone who was suffering. The ocean was calling, and she had to answer. She climbed over the railing before I could stop her. For a moment, she just stood there on the narrow ledge, her hair whipping in the salt wind. She looked back at me one last time and smiled, but it wasn't her smile anymore. It was older, sadder, like it belonged to someone else entirely. The splash was smaller than I expected. By the time I screamed for help and the crew came running, there was nothing left but dark water and the echo of my voice bouncing off the waves. They searched for hours with spotlights and life preservers, but we all knew she was gone. The ocean had claimed another victim. The rest of the cruise was a nightmare of police interviews and paperwork. The other passengers avoided me, like I was cursed, whispering behind their hands about the boyfriend who couldn't save his girlfriend from the ghost. The crew tried to be sympathetic, but I could see the relief in their eyes when we finally reached port. I flew home alone with Sarah's suitcase and a head full of questions nobody could answer. The official report called it a tragic accident, probably brought on by seasickness and disorientation. But I know what I saw that night. I know who Sarah was talking to on that deck, even if nobody else believes me. Sometimes I dream about that cruise ship, still sailing somewhere in the dark water with its cargo of ghosts. I see Sarah standing at the railing with Margaret Whitmore, both of them waiting for the next lonely soul to hear their call. They're not alone anymore, but that doesn't make me feel any better. The worst part is knowing that somewhere out there, the SS Meridian is still offering cheap anniversary deals to young couples looking for adventure. And every time someone books that cabin with the shifting wallpaper and the creaking bed, Margaret and Sarah get a little less lonely. The ocean is patient, and it's always hungry for more. I never believed in ghosts until the night Emma disappeared into the Atlantic. We'd booked the cruise to celebrate our first anniversary, thinking 7 days on the ocean would be romantic. The brochure showed happy couples dancing under starlight, but they didn't mention the ship's darker history. They never do. The MV Serafina looked impressive from the dock, all gleaming white paint and polished brass railings. Emma was practically bouncing with excitement as we boarded, her camera clicking away at everything from the ornate staircase to the vintage lifeboats. I was focused on finding our cabin and getting settled, but she wanted to explore every deck before dinner. Her enthusiasm was infectious, and I found myself getting caught up in her joy. Our room was on deck 7, with a small balcony overlooking the endless blue water. The decor was old-fashioned but elegant, all dark wood and burgundy fabrics that reminded me of an old-timey gentleman's club. Emma immediately claimed the side of the bed closest to the balcony door, saying she wanted to fall asleep to the sound of the waves. I should have paid more attention to how intensely she stared out at that water. The first sign something was wrong came at dinner that night. We were sitting in the main dining room, sharing a bottle of wine and laughing about the overly formal waiters, when Emma suddenly went quiet. She was looking past my shoulder with this strange, focused expression, like she was watching something fascinating that I couldn't see. When I turned around, there was nothing there but an empty corner near the kitchen doors. She shook it off when I asked, claiming she thought she saw someone she knew from college. But the rest of the meal she kept glancing back at that same spot, her fork halfway to her mouth as she stared into empty space. The wine sat untouched in her glass and she barely responded when I tried to restart our conversation about wedding plans. That night, I woke up around 2 a.m. to find Emma standing on our balcony. She was gripping the railing in her pajamas, her hair whipping around her face in the salt wind. The ship was cutting through calm seas, but she looked like she was bracing herself against a hurricane. I called her name twice before she turned around, and her eyes had this glassy, distant look that made my stomach drop. She said she couldn't sleep because of the voices. They were coming from the water, she claimed, just barely audible over the engine noise and the waves. Women's voices crying and calling out in languages she didn't recognize. I listened for a full minute, but all I heard was the usual ship sounds and the endless rush of water against the hull. The next day, Emma seemed more like herself during breakfast and the morning activities. We played shuffleboard on the upper deck and took stupid tourist photos by the pool. But as evening approached, she started getting that distant look again. During the captain's welcome dinner, she barely touched her food, instead staring out the massive windows, at the darkening ocean, like she was waiting for something to surface. I asked one of the older crew members about the ship's history after Emma went to bed early that second night. His face went pale when I mentioned the voices, and he looked around nervously before leaning in close. The Serafina had been sailing these same routes for 30 years, he whispered, and every voyage brought at least one passenger who heard them. The voices of the women who'd gone overboard during the ship's early years. He told me about Isabella Montoya, a young bride from Barcelona who'd thrown herself into the Atlantic in 1994 during her honeymoon cruise. Then there was Claire Murphy, an Irish teacher who'd jumped from Deck 9 in 1998 after claiming she heard her dead sister calling from the waves. At least 6 women had taken their own lives from this ship over the decades, and passengers still reported hearing their voices on calm nights. I didn't sleep at all that night, watching Emma toss and turn in the bed beside me. She was muttering in her sleep, having conversations with people who weren't there. Every few minutes, she'd sit up suddenly and look toward the balcony door like someone had called her name. When I touched her shoulder to wake her, she'd look at me with confusion, as if she couldn't remember where she was. By the third day, other passengers were starting to notice Emma's behaviour. She'd stop mid-sentence during conversations to tilt her head and listen to something only she could hear. At the poolside barbecue, she wandered away from our table 3 times, always drifting toward the railings that overlooked the water. Each time I brought her back, she seemed surprised to find herself there. The ship's doctor tried to convince me it was just seasickness affecting her inner ear and causing disorientation. He prescribed some pills that were supposed to help with motion sickness, but Emma refused to take them. She said they would block out the voices, and she needed to hear what they were trying to tell her. The urgency in her voice scared me more than anything else. That night, I pretended to be asleep while keeping one eye on Emma. Around midnight, she got up and walked to the balcony door, pressing her face against the glass like she was trying to see something in the darkness below. She stood there for over an hour, occasionally nodding as if responding to a conversation. When she finally came back to bed, she whispered that they were getting stronger. The 4th day was when I realised I was losing her completely. Emma spent most of the morning standing at various railings around the ship, always looking down at the water with that same intense focus. She said the voices were clearer now, that she could almost make out individual words. They were lonely, she explained, and they'd been waiting so long for someone who could hear them properly. I tried to keep her distracted with activities, but nothing held her attention for long. During the afternoon dance class, she'd suddenly stop moving and stare out the windows. At dinner, she pushed her food around her plate while having whispered conversations with empty chairs. The other passengers started giving us a wide berth, probably thinking she was having some kind of breakdown. The crew was getting nervous too. I caught them having hushed conversations in the corridors, and they'd stop talking whenever I approached. The head steward pulled me aside after dinner and suggested we might want to consider getting off at the next port. He said the ship's medical facilities weren't equipped to handle passengers who were, as he delicately put it, experiencing psychological distress. I agreed, but Emma fought me on it. She said she couldn't leave now, not when the voices were finally starting to trust her. They'd been trying to communicate for years, she claimed, but most people couldn't hear them or were too scared to listen. She was special, chosen to be their messenger. The way she said it, with such absolute conviction, made my blood run cold. That night, I moved my pillow to the chair by the door so I could watch her sleep. But around 3 a.m, I must have dozed off because I woke up to find the bed empty and the balcony door standing wide open. The salt air was rushing into the room, and I could hear Emma's voice outside, raised in animated conversation with someone who wasn't there. She was leaning far over the balcony railing, reaching down toward the water like she was trying to grab something just out of reach. Her feet were barely touching the deck, and one strong wave could have knocked her off balance. I grabbed her around the waist and pulled her back inside, but she fought me like a wild animal, screaming that I was interrupting something important. After that, I didn't dare sleep at all. I sat in that chair for the next 2 nights, watching Emma pace around our cabin like a caged animal. She said the voices were getting impatient, that they'd been waiting decades for someone like her to join them. The loneliness was driving them mad, she explained, and they needed her help to find peace. On our last night aboard the ship, Emma finally broke free. I'd gone to the bathroom for maybe 30 seconds, but when I came out, she was gone. I ran through the corridors in my pajamas, checking every deck and calling her name. Other passengers poked their heads out of their doors to see what the commotion was about, but no one had seen her. I found her on deck 12, the highest point on the ship, standing on the narrow ledge outside the safety railing. The wind was howling up there, and the drop to the water looked like it went on forever. She was smiling for the first time in days, tears streaming down her face as she looked down at the black ocean below. She told me they were all there waiting for her, Isabella and Claire and all the others who'd answered the call before. They weren't lonely anymore because they had each other, but they needed one more to complete their circle. Emma had been chosen because she could hear them so clearly, because her heart was open to their pain. I begged her to come back down, promising we'd get help when we reached port the next morning, but she just shook her head sadly and said it was too late for that. The voices had gotten too strong to ignore, and the only way to make them stop was to join them. She said she loved me, but this was something she had to do. The splash seemed impossibly far away, swallowed up by the engine noise and the wind. By the time the crew responded to my screams, there was nothing to see but dark water and foam. They launched lifeboats and swept the area with searchlights for hours, but we all knew Emma was gone. The ocean had claimed another victim for its growing collection of voices. I spent the rest of that night in the ship's medical bay, sedated and wrapped in blankets, while officials took my statement. They were kind but sceptical, treating Emma's death as a tragic case of someone having a psychotic break triggered by the stress of travel. The official report would list it as suicide while temporarily insane. Nothing more mysterious than that. But I know what really happened on the MV Serafina. I know Emma heard those voices as clearly as I'm hearing my own thoughts right now. And sometimes, late at night when I can't sleep, I swear I can hear them too, faint and far away, but getting stronger with each passing year. Emma's voice is among them now, calling out across the dark water for someone else who might listen. The ship still sails those same routes, still offers romantic anniversary packages to couples looking for adventure on the high seas. And every few years, another passenger goes missing. Another woman answers the call of the voices that drift up from the Atlantic depths. The crew knows, but they never warn anyone. They just clean up the paperwork and wait for the next voyage to begin.